Hi, I'm Mike Bellevue, and usually I'm here to talk to you about guns, but today we're going to do something a little bit different. I got a request from one of our subscribers to talk about my favorite knives, so today it's going to be all about blades. I'm not a knife collector, but over the years I've gathered up a few blades, and I use them for specific purposes, and I'll run you through them. We'll start off with pocket knives. I actually have quite a few pocket knives. I just tend to pick them up, but there are really only 3 that I use with any frequency, and we'll go through those. The first is this little Gerber mini power frame. It's a locking knife. It's got a locking leg right here. It only has a 2 1/4 inch blade. This is a knife that I carried every day at work in business clothes for years and years. Now, the only problem I ever had with this, it's a great knife, by the way, very light. Drop it in your pants pocket, doesn't take up any room at all, and it does the job for most anything you want. And I suppose it might defend your life if you had to, better than not having anything at all. But it's just a good general utility blade. My only issue was since 9/11, I've lost probably a dozen of these things to the TSA by just forgetting to take them out of my pocket before I get on a flight. So I got in the habit of buying them 4 and 5 at a time and putting them away because I just lost so many of them. Now, since I retired for real a year ago, I have not carried this very much. And the knife that I find myself carrying most often is this Benchmade knife. And this was actually a gift from Black Hills Ammunition, and it's just fantastic. It's a nice little lock blade folder. Very sharp, and you can see it's a Osborne, very, very good. Fits comfortably in my pocket. It does most of the chores that I would want a knife to use, and I've carried this every day for the last year. And I've got to say, like most people of my generation, I think, I've carried a knife every day of my life, almost without fail, from the time I was probably 5 or 6 years old. In fact, it was no big deal to have knives at school when I was a kid. I mean, these days, of course, they'd put your kid in prison for that, but we used to play mumbly peg in the schoolyard, which just shows you how times have changed. Now, this knife, which is a rigid knife, I've had this for about, well, I'm going to say 18 years. It's another folder, lock blade. Got a very easy thumb snap. Get the blade out. It's got a serrated edge. This is what I carry if I'm going somewhere where my concealed carry permit is no good. This is purely a defensive knife. This thing has never cut a piece of string in its life, and it never will. But when I feel like I need a weapon and can't have a gun with me, that's what I bring. So those are the folders. The next group of knives are what I'll call the sporting knives. We've got 3 of those, and we'll just quickly run through them. This is my little buck knife. This has been my hunting knife for 30 years now, and as you can see, it's still in great shape. When I was a kid in the 60s, buck knives were it. I mean, they had that logo, pounding the blade through a nail. Buck knives were what everybody wanted. My dad carried a buck knife. I had to have a buck knife. And this little guy is just what I need out in the woods. I don't need any more knife than that. It's excellent. This is a Cold Steel Pendleton Hunter. Like all of Cold Steel's products, it is well made, excellent, razor sharp. This is a knife that's in my grab and go pack, and that's always packed up, ready to go with clothes, water, weapons, food, some tools, a sleeping bag, just in case we've got to get out of Dodge. If 3 Mile Island goes bad or whatever happens, that's what goes in the truck. So this lives in there 100% of the time because I know it is always going to do its job if it's needed. The last of the sporting knives is this Blind Horse Knives large workhorse. And this one has some sentimental value to me. When I retired from my job at the Navy, I worked for the Navy for 30 years, and when I went out I was a Deputy Director of Maritime Weapon Systems Support for the NAV ICP, Naval Inventory Control Point, part of NAVSUP and Alphabet Soup, right? But I was the deputy director of that division, which meant the civilian head of it, and the military officer I worked for, Commander Bob Campbell, who just retired a couple of weeks ago, gave me this as a personal gift at my retirement. And it means a lot to me. Bob was the last guy I worked for when I was working for the Navy, and this is a knife that's always going to stay around. It's an excellent knife as well. I mean, Blind Horse knives are extremely high quality. All right, that was the end of my practical working knives. This next group of knives are strictly photo props, and if you've read my magazine articles, you've probably seen these numerous times. It's the only thing I bought them for, and they look good next to a gun. So there are two of them, and I'll show you what they look like. All right, this is my buffalo skinner, and it's made in Pakistan. It's pretty sharp, but I'm willing to bet that if you cut a few sticks of butter with it, the blade would probably dull up. But it looks good, so I use this generally when I'm photographing single-shot hunting rifles or things like that, because it just looks appropriate to them. This little number is a coffin-handled Bowie knife, named for the handle, obviously. And this is a very appropriate early 19th century knife. Now, it's also made in Pakistan. Like I say, the steel of the blade is probably about as good as you'd get in your average tin can, but it looks fantastic. So this gets photographed generally with early weapons, but I just love the look of it so much. And to get a good one like this, it's ridiculously expensive. So as a photo prop, this thing was pretty good. Well, the next category of knives are the ones that I use for historical impressions. And there are two of those, and we'll just go through them pretty quick. This is my ball-headed belt knife, or scalping knife some people would call it. This was made for me by my friend Bruce Roberts, who is an outstanding craftsman, and very, very authentic. It's got a curly maple handle. So this is my 18th century knife. So when I'm dressed in 18th century clothes, or if I'm at a reenactment, this is the knife I'm carrying. It's razor sharp, does its camp chores very well, and very personal to me because Bruce made it, and of course he also made the sheath. He's a fantastic leather worker, woodworker, you name it. The guy is a real craftsman. This knife is my cowboy action knife, or my 19th century impression knife. This is an original knife made in 1860, and Bruce cleaned it up a little bit for me, but I bought it from an antique vendor. And actually, it's excellent steel, balances very well, and this is more typical of what people really use than all the gigantic Bowies that you see around. I mean, this was an all-purpose knife. On the trail, on the farm, it did whatever you needed a knife to do, and it still does. I find this to be just one of the best knives I've ever had. Well, that's the end of the small blades. I've got a few larger blades I'm going to show you, and these two are tomahawks or belt axes. I'm working on a pipe tomahawk, which would have been used by Native Americans, but that's not done yet. But for the most part, the colonists, the Anglo-Americans, they didn't use those pipe hawks at all. They used hammer pole hatchets. And we've got two examples right here that I'll show you. This is a Cold Steel Company Trailhawk. And they're not very expensive as these things go. I mean, I could get a custom one made just like this from an 18th century forge, and it would cost me $200 or $300. These from Cold Steel cost much less, but they are very authentically styled, very authentically designed, and they are made with excellent steel. The only thing I had to do was kind of defarb it a little bit because they come with this black paint all over the blade, and the handle does not have a very attractive stain on it. So a little bit of work, and you've got an excellent frontiersman's type tomahawk. And I've had this 10, 12 years, I guess, and it has done fine for me on the trail. A few years ago, the Mold and Gun Shop came out with this design of a belt axe. It was based on an authentic 18th century head. My friend Bruce Roberts did some work on some of the design work on it. And I like it because it has a little bit better cutting surface. Now they're available either cast or forged. This one is a forged blade. And this is actually a fantastic little trail axe if you're trekking. I mean, it's good for chopping down small branches to make fires or doing anything you need. It'll even split. I mean, it's a nice little axe. And of course, the hammer pawl, instead of a pipe, lets you drive in tent stakes or do anything that you need to do with them. So this thing has become quite a workhorse for me. It's got a little bit of a shorter handle than the cold steel. It's not quite as much weaponized, you might say. It's more toolized, but I like it a lot. And the last blade I want to show you is a pretty long one. This is my cold steel Viking sword. Now, what I'm going to say is going to sound crazy, but I think everybody ought to have a sword, because you never know when the power is going to go out. But I've got a few swords. By far, this one is my best one for practical purposes. So let's take a look at it. Here's the Viking sword in all of its glory. It's 36 inches long. It's got a fully forward blade. Unlike most Viking swords, this one actually has a pretty effective stabbing point. And it's got the dual slashing cutting blades. So it's very good. It's got a heavy pommel, a short guard, but enough of a guard. It's a little, you know, compared to historical Viking swords I've seen, this would be a little bit of a long guard. But it's got a 5-lobed pommel. It's got a lot of blade speed. It's very well balanced. When I was younger, probably 16 or 17 years ago, I went through a knife fighting school, and as the first part of that curriculum, they taught you how to fight with swords. The curriculum was basically saber, bowie knife, small knives, folding knives, and then empty hand defense against a blade. So, though I am in no way a fencer, I have learned what you would call, I guess, medieval through 18th century sword fighting techniques. So I learned the 9 angles of attack and how to translate that from a sword down to a small blade. So ever since then, I've really been kind of bugs about swords, and I've always had at least one good sword around the house. So this is the guy I've got now, and that's it. Those are my favorite blades. And after this video, we'll get back to gun stuff.